We talk about US-China tech competition a lot. Much of the debate is like a scoreboard. Who's ahead in AI? Who's winning EVs? Who's falling behind in chips? But is that the right way to think about US-China tech competition? And what does it mean for geopolitics? After all, tech isn't just an economic story, it's also about power. Control over chips shapes military capabilities. Control over rare earths shapes diplomacy. Standards, supply chains, and scale shape which states have leverage and who is vulnerable. Today, we're going to explore the geopolitical aspect of US-China tech competition with two of the authors of a major new report from our colleagues in the CSIS Economic Security and Technology Department. It's called Tech Edge, a living playbook for America's technology long game. Welcome to State of Play. I'm Will Todman, Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this podcast, we bring together our leading experts to unpack the latest geopolitical developments from around the world and what it all means. So today I am joined by Mark Dallas and Ilaria Mazzocco. Mark Dallas is a non-resident senior associate in the EST department and also a professor of political science, Asian studies, and science, technology, and society at Union College in New York. Oh, that's a lot. Welcome, Mark. Welcome to State of Play.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
And Ilaria Mazzocco is a senior fellow and the deputy director of the CSIS trustee chair in Chinese business and economics. And Ilaria, a lot of your work focuses on industrial policy, Chinese climate policy, and the intersection between the energy transition and national security. You also have the privilege of coming from what I consider to be one of the most beautiful countries in the world. I think I'm allowed to say that. So, Ilaria.
Yes. Well, yeah. I've been in the US for a very long time, though, so it's been a while. Yeah.
Well, Ilaria, welcome to State of Play. Thank you so much for joining. So I want to start, as I said, we're here to talk about this report that you just put out. And Mark, maybe I could turn to you first and say, why did you write this report? Sort of what problem is it trying to tackle? How did it come about? Can you give us a bit of the background?
Sure. Yes, of course. Thanks very much for the invitation again. I want to highlight up front that it's not my report. There were a lot of co-authors here. I think 15 altogether, but it's quite the report. But in any case, so I think you already sort of in your intro hit on one of the things that we observed, which is that there's lots of material out there now, obviously, on US-China tech competition. And a lot of them do hit on, like you said, who's ahead and who's behind, or what's the newest breakthrough or something like that. And we were trying to ask sort of a more fundamental question, which is what drives tech competitiveness, right? What are the fundamental underlying drivers? And we hit on and we focus on this idea of ecosystems and getting ecosystems right for different technologies. And what ecosystems are is they're a combination of firms, the inter-firm linkages with each other, obviously government support, universities and researchers, national labs, as well as all the various public-private partnerships and whatnot, and importantly, allies also. So this is not an American-based idea of ecosystems. Ecosystems can be international. And so we focus a lot of the report on those ecosystems that matter. The second sort of problem we had when we looked out there is we saw, we observed the landscape of technology and we're like, wow, the US is really strong in some its technologies and really weak in others. And China is really strong in others and really weak in others. And so why? How can we explain it? And obviously ecosystems was part of that answer about the health and quality of those ecosystems. But it also helped us figure out with limited resources, what should the US target, like the US government? Where should resources go? We found too often that U.S. companies and the government looked at sort of the shiny new technology out there. Quantum is next, and we got to be strong in that. And we lost track of underlying technologies that you need to create those leading edge complex technologies. What we call the industrial base. What kinds of things are we
talking about?
So shiny new technologies, we have a 2x2 sort of technology framework, and we classify technologies based on how complicated they are and then sort of how they can diffuse in the economy. So as an example, AI is one of these shiny technologies. It's very complex, and everyone knows it's a general purpose technology that's going to diffuse everywhere. I mean, a lot of the listeners are probably using it. So that's part of the diffusion. Jet engines we're also extremely good at in the United States. Those are also incredibly complicated, but they're special purpose, right? They don't have the diffusion. So those are a lot of the leading edge, complicated technologies that we do want to continue to be competitive in. However, the other side are things like what we call production technologies, which are like machine tools and other types of machinery that are critical for the capacity to make jet engines, for instance, right? You need the tools to make them, specialized chemicals and whatnot. And we've lost our competitiveness in those. Those are, a bit less sexy technologies. And the final one are base technologies. Those are like critical minerals, metals, specialized metals and steel and aluminum, maybe batteries and things like that. And those, China has been incredibly competitive in. And so that gives you a broader sense. And we're trying to push US policy and firms to become more competitive in the ones that we've really lost. And we argue that it's really these different industries have different types of ecosystems that make one competitive. And the areas we're competitive in, the ecosystems are strong.
Well, if I can just jump in and give another practical example of what Mark was just saying is I think it's become actually over the past couple of years, people have really sort of internalized this more, but I think we're responding also to the idea that the fact that China became the manufacturing hub for the world has enabled it and has had a positive effect on some other areas that we weren't necessarily thinking about, right? It's given it advantages in innovation and in production of more advanced types of technologies, right? It's given advantages even some of the sort of more leading edge technologies as well. So I think it's more of this understanding of like, how do these different capabilities play together, and then as a combination also give certain types of advantages to a country's ecosystem, right? Innovation ecosystem. But that's not just about China, right? It's also about United States and U.S. allies, which in some cases, I think when we worry too much about China, we overlook some of the advantages that we do have and that some of our allies also have.
So I want to talk about some of the advantages and just make sure that, everyone listening is kind of on the same page about what are typically the advantages that we think of that China has, maybe to start with. You just mentioned manufacturing, Ilaria, but then said it sort of extends beyond that. What, in your minds, what are the key advantages that China seems to have?
Well, China has very patient capital, right? That has been a key factor that has enabled, the financing of technologies that, frankly, are kind of difficult to finance, right? Like this is one of the challenges of competing with China is ensuring that that the government or companies can provide sort of sustained investment in areas that are not necessarily always particularly profitable. And so that's an area where China has performed quite strongly. And it's also had very, very consistent policy in some areas as well, which has also been a challenge in some other countries. So those are some examples. Obviously, there's more, and we go through different types. As Mark says, right, in the report, we go over sort of economy-wide fundamentals and then technology-specific enablers and governance of the ecosystem, right? So we look at a lot of different factors. But I think these are some of the big ones.
And if I could just add a couple other things, Ilaria's absolutely right. Patient capital is critical, and it's something that the U.S. really lacks. We've got a lot of capital, but it's not patient for sort of low margin, low profit, long-term investments like that. But I think also China is exceptional in engineering innovation. So their capacity, they have, very dense industrial clusters, lots of suppliers close to each other. They can prototype very fast. So there's an idea out there, right? How do you get an idea to scale it for mass production? And so China can prototype very quickly and very well, testing to see what works and what doesn't work. And of course, they're extremely well known for scaling. Right? They can scale technologies for mass production very well, much easier to permit, to get, land permits, energy to where it needs to be, as well as capital as well. And so those are sort of the underlying factors that drive competitiveness across a range of different industries that China does extremely well.
Yeah, and those clusters, right? Those industrial clusters are what really enable that China speed, which a lot of companies are now talking about, right? That now it's not, international companies, multinationals, they talk about China not just as a place where they can produce cheaply, but also a place where they can create new products very cheaply and bring them to the market and very quickly, right, at a very high quality and be very innovative. And so those are sort of some of the advantages that China has as an ecosystem, right? We're not necessarily talking about this is like a specific product or anything, but these are just generally speaking some of the general advantages China does have.
I remember it was, I don't know, a Wired video or something where there was a UK entrepreneur who had a product and was asked, like, why can't you make it here or something? And they said, only in Shenzhen could we do this. Can we take this innovative idea, prototype it, get it tested really fast? They can prototype within no time and then aim for commercialization. So it was like impossible to do anywhere else. And those are some of the advantages that China had, just as an illustration of that.
Yeah. So before we move to the US, I want to talk a bit about what kind of geopolitical power this gives China. So you've talked about, the patient capital it has, the engineering innovation, the ability to prototype and test, and then to scale quickly and cheaply. How does that translate into geopolitical power in your minds?
Obviously, for just common consumer goods, mass production, that's not something that I think really leverages geopolitical power. But a lot of these products are, they're critical as an industrial base for further types of production. But also a lot of them, the world has become such where you have intense concentration of capabilities in certain industries and portions of fragments of industries. And that's where this idea of sort of choke points comes in, where you can weaponize choke points and whatnot. And this is true across the board. So this is not China specific. And, we used to think of this as an advantage. This was the benefits of globalization. Everyone specializes and you get really good at one piece of the puzzle, and then you come together and you not just trade, but you actually have your engineers working together to build new innovations. And so this was the promise of part of the promise of globalization. Everyone wins in a way. Now, you throw geopolitics into that mix, and now suddenly the picture almost turns upside down, because now all of those wonderful benefits become risks. And so that's part of the thing that this report is getting at. It's about not just sort of, run faster and do more innovation, but how do you defend economic security? How do you sort of defend these networks that we are urging to continue to be international? Like I said, allies are critical in this, but how do you defend? And so these exceptional areas where China is just clearly superior. Like, for instance, everyone now knows that in rare earths, China has 90% processing capacity, right? And so this has become obviously huge news recently. Well, this has been the case for a very long time. It's not actually a new thing. It's just that the weaponization has become new. And secondly, there's a lot of other areas that are like this. I mean, rare earths came to the fore and in the news because of relatively recent events, past few years. But most fragments of industries, parts of industries are like this, basically, which is what the predicament that we're in now.
I agree with Mark. And I think another way of thinking about this is that there's probably like three broad categories, right? One is the applications on a purely military scale, right? A lot of these areas like AI, jet engines, right? These are really just important from a military perspective. So that's like hard power, right? The second is the choke points, right? Which Mark just explained, I think, very effectively, right? So that's the sort of economic security. And then I think there's this broader question of like, well, if China becomes the provider of technology globally for a lot of countries, and I would say, increasingly we're seeing this in the global south, for example, where, I look a lot at energy technologies, right? China is becoming sort of the provider of choice in many areas. If China does become that provider, what does that mean? Does that change geopolitics? It might not in some cases, right? It might be because of other constraints, but in some cases it might, right? There might be that sort of combination of economic and soft power that really has sort of a geopolitical implication. So I think that's, China's role also as an exporter, and also, of course, domestically as being much less dependent, maybe in some cases, on imports of a technology. Now, we're not there yet, obviously, and China is still very dependent on the world for its innovation ecosystem. But I think, those are sort of the questions when we look at the trajectory of how quickly China has become a very important innovator globally, and how well it's been doing in some technologies.
Ilaria's right on that there are some technologies that become almost like infrastructure. And in our report, we call them stack technologies. Those are things like AI, cloud computing, advanced telecommunications. And those are important in their own right and, for a lot of reasons in terms of being general purpose technologies, but they're also in many ways rule setting. I don't want to get too technical, but people have probably heard of this idea of platforms, right? And it's sort of like it can be a winner takes all type of situation where, think of operating systems on your mobile phone. There's only two in the whole world, right? Google Android and Apple iOS. Every Chinese phone, basically, I know Huawei's trying to build their own
Harmony
because
is becoming more.
Harmony, like, it is, but they're going to have I would argue they're going to have a tough climb globally. But yes, you're right. China is a large enough market that Harmony OS Next could become a third, but it's difficult, extremely difficult for that to happen. And so some technologies really are, you can think of them as infrastructure and rule setting. However, again, I want to reiterate that those are important and the US must be competitive in those, partly for this rule setting dimension. However, there's lots, as we just talked about with rare earths, those critical technologies like advanced semiconductors, they rely on rare earths. So something very basic. Again, we all know this now, but it's just illustrative of the larger concept that something very fundamental feeds into these leading technologies. And so really you have to try to be competitive with allies across these domains.
I was just going to say on your last point, Ilaria, about the soft power, this is something anecdotally that I've really noticed over the last kind of 15 years or so of focusing on the Middle East and the changing perceptions about which technology is most desirable to have. And I really think it did go from being, everyone wanted an iPhone to now, people are really happy to have very advanced Chinese phones. That there is something to be said, I think, about how broader opinions about China do change when, with some of these technological advancements. But maybe I can bring us back to the US now. So what would you both consider to be the key advantages that the United States still has in relation to technology?
Well, I already mentioned the stack technologies as something that we really do quite well in. And we're very good at software, hardware integration in these stack technologies. But we're also showing that we can actually build physical infrastructure fairly well. And what I'm referring to are like sort of AI data centers. So that's still there. What I think was interesting, though, is that another category of technologies that we looked at, which we call precision technologies. And the example here, the example we dove into is jet engines, but also, things like semiconductor manufacturing equipment, the machinery for semiconductors, medical imaging and whatnot. But with jet engines, and this might give a sense of what an ecosystem is. Like it's a manufacturer, like we just talked about how, the US has lost manufacturing capability. But jet engines is a manufacturing capability, right? And so we are extraordinarily strong global leaders in and continue to be. And we argue again that it's these ecosystems. And so these ecosystems require companies to have really deep ties with each other. So a jet engine life cycle is like 10 years, okay? So, the airlines, United and American Airlines and others, foreign airlines as well, they want good quality engines, right? And so they build deep relationships with GE and Rolls-Royce and other engine makers in which they assure, basically there's this contract called Power by the Hour, where the airlines, what they want is they want planes flying, and they don't want any problems with the engines. So they literally pay GE for every hour that a plane is working in the air. Wow. You're getting paid for just basically doing your job, right? Yeah. When things break down, now GE has to run in, fix everything. So the incentives are, and by the way, this has been around for like 60 years, this idea of a contract. But what it does is it binds these companies deeply together so that they're cooperating on a decade scale, and they're cooperating for the next generation. But also you pile on top of this, excellent like FAA regulations in which, like US and Europeans have tens of thousands of engines that are in the air because they've been certified. Well, all of those engines, they create data that they all share with each other as well. So there's trust between all of these actors, okay? Finally, we've got the Defense Department. They produce, they're a huge funder of airplanes. And so when people are stopped traveling during COVID, it can be countercyclical, meaning that the government can step in to purchase more and support U.S. firms. And finally, universities, right? We've got exceptional aerospace engineering as well as vocational training. So that's what an ecosystem is. You can see all of these players, they operate and interoperate with each other well. And jet engines has not become a victim of the logic that Ilaria and I have been talking about, where China has become exceptional at manufacturing and really hollowed out American manufacturing base.
Because something that really shocked me in the report is China doesn't produce any jet engines. Is that right? I mean,
on the commercial side, so they produce jet engines, they've got military stuff. They don't have certified engines that are in the air right now, even by their own version of FAA. And that's difficult because if you don't have them in the air, you're not learning, how does a jet engine work in freezing versus the tropics versus, all of these weather conditions around the world. If you have tens of thousands of engines in the air, you're gathering tremendous amount of data. So it's a bit of like a circular thing where if you can't get them in the air, you're not going to be learning and innovating as quickly and as well. So it is a handicap. Yeah.
But you can see here also how the areas where China is really strong in, like scaling, speed, low costs, are not really applicable to some of these technologies, right? You can't, improve as you or tweak things as you sell things and you put them in the air when it's a jet engine, because it needs to be perfect, right? You can't, otherwise the plane crashes, right? So that's very different from, a battery or a car even, or certainly a cell phone, right? Areas where instead Chinese companies have done really well. And so you need that precision, you need that long-term existing relationships. And I think actually some of these dynamics we also found in some segments of precision tools, machine tools that the U.S. is not necessarily a leader in anymore, but some of the U.S. allies, right? Japan and Germany in particular have really strong companies that perform really well. And here too, there's been a bit of a lag from China, even though they're pushing very hard to try and improve and break into this. I will also say in both cases, there's been very little tech transfer on the part of Western firms. They've really held on to their technology, and so there's been limited learning opportunity for Chinese firms.
Interesting. So what advantages then, geopolitically speaking, does the US get from these advantages? So the stack technologies, the precision technologies, the trust in these ecosystems. How does that manifest on the geopolitical sphere?
Sure. I mean, already I talked about how some of these technologies are, like global rule setting types of things. And countries can push back on that too. I mean, Europe's very, very concerned about, sort of US tech dominance in terms of cloud computing and whatnot. And so those clearly have a geopolitical dimension to it. On the flip side, the whole, I would argue that one of the major reasons for the sort of technology war is Huawei installing 5G telecommunications equipment all over the world, including in allied networks, and the advantages that could accrue to that. And that's in many ways one of the impetuses of the world we now live in is this realization. So these are technologies. There is the economic dimension to it. Of course, companies make money, people get jobs. There's higher wages with higher tech and things like that, oftentimes. But a lot of these also have geopolitical dimensions to them, of course.
Ilaria, anything to add on the geopolitical advantages the US has? And maybe this will be a segue as we begin to talk about alliances as well, because I do want to talk about
I was actually going to say that one thing we haven't talked about yet is that the US does have allies, right? China doesn't really have anything comparable to the U.S. ally system. And of course, we do know that there's been a lot of changes underway in the relationship between, certainly, I think, in particular, the U.S. and Europe. But yet, this is still like a really, really important factor. And especially because a lot of U.S. allies do hold very advanced technology. They do have very significant capabilities. And so that is, I think, actually sort of a really sort of an area where geopolitics and economic security really overlap. And so I think, for example, the current undertaking of the administration with the Pax Silica is a really interesting example of how you might put that into practice in terms of sort of getting, drawing in allies because of the U.S. advantages, but also then creating something stronger because of that coordination among them.
Can you explain what that is, what Pax Silica is?
It's an initiative that is really centered around secure supply chains for artificial intelligence, semiconductors, right? The whole sort of AI stack. And it involves several allied nations. It was just very recently launched, so I think we'll have to see more of the details as they emerge. But that sort of example, right, of the U.S. has leadership in AI and the AI stack, but it is certainly something that relies on a very complex supply chain, and several allies could really help enable and enhance that. And there's a very strong competition with China, which many allies are also concerned about, right? So I think from that perspective, this could be certainly an interesting model. We'll see, of course, how it develops. But again, this is something where China doesn't have an equivalent sort of network it can draw on. Certainly, we talk a lot about the BRICS. We talk about the relationship with Russia. Of course, your department, Will, has done a lot of work on the BRIC network, right? But it's really, I think, not comparable to what the United States has when it comes to the U.S. relationship with its allies. I mean, in part because also these other countries that China has these relationships with just don't have the same level of advanced technology that, say, Europe or Japan or South Korea or some other, key U.S. allies have.
Yeah, and I would say exactly. I agree with everything Ilaria said, and so that's why we say that alliances and allies are part of these ecosystems very much, and because so geopolitical power really comes from the interdependence that you can shape, right? Not senses of autarky or we have to make it in America or whatever. Skill, talent, specialized capabilities are scattered all over the world now. And so it's perfectly fine for critical technologies or nodes in these technologies to be domestic or to be, let's call it, friend-shored, let's say, with allies, because then you're part of shaping these interdependencies. And allied production really should amplify U.S. strengths. I mean, I think there are something like 60 critical minerals out there. And the idea that the U.S. is going to suddenly figure out, not just do that, but invest the money and the mining and the processing of all the, it's crazy. So even on rare earths, relationships with Australia and Malaysia and Brazil, probably, ideally, are all going to be important for ensuring economic security in these sorts of areas. Whether it's American first or America only, that thrust, that zeitgeist just is not something the report builds on. And of course, China's got its own version, right, of insisting on autarky as much as possible. So we really kind of push against that quite a bit and see that as really, fraying allied relationships is just not good, as well as more traditional, sort of defend the network. And those, we should be doing a lot more multilateralism on that as well, in terms of, things we do, information sharing, or we traditionally have, harmonizing on export licenses and things like that, providing assistance to countries to improve these sorts of tools. We should be doing more of it and continuing that, as well as trying to multilateralize some of these more traditional policies that are more traditionally thought of as defending the network. And so, but I think those are well known. I think my prior point about making sure you are at the table shaping interdependence, I think is the really important one from the report.
So maybe before we start drawing to a close, I could just ask you kind of what other takeaways do you want to leave the audience with, or what would you like to see? What are some of the recommendations of the report? And I know it is a great big long report, and I would encourage our listeners to read it carefully, but maybe you can just give us a couple of the highlights.
We have a whole chapter on policy recommendations and whatnot. There's quite a few in there. I think the one that maybe would stand out the most is, Ilaria said, speed to scale. And because it's such a weakness, it's that we call it the missing middle. The U.S. does great in laboratory stuff, but to get great ideas out there and commercialize and scale them, we've lost a lot of capabilities in that. And so there are existing things out there. So Manufacturing USA networks, which I think it dates at least to Obama, if not earlier. There's iterations of that, essentially. And I think in our report, we say, to build those industrial commons, we really need to focus on sort of later stage, things that are closer to commercialization. That's really where we have a lack and think we drop the ball, essentially. And engineering, innovation, testing, prototyping, things like that. And it always has to continue to be public-led. You don't want these things, you don't want the private companies with their own private interests to be sort of driving this. That's not going to achieve national goals. So I think that's one area. We have a whole thing on workforce, national AI workforce consortium to, there's going to be a lot of like basic skills like HVAC skills, specialized electricians and plumbing and things like a lot of these advanced technologies, building a advanced semiconductor fab requires specialized plumbers, right? And we don't have that. And so there are ideas in there on how to make sure that credentials cross state borders, like vocational credentials, apprenticeships, national instructor corps that is standardized. So in other words, standardizing these skill sets, these vocational skill sets, and making them portable so that you can go anywhere in the country and they're recognized. So those are things that I think are, a bit more unusual. I think that's very bipartisan also, This is nice, and is a bit distinctive that we really emphasize in the report.
Great, thank you. So now it's time for our typical quickfire round of questions that we end all of these episodes on. And so my first one for you both is, please can you sum up the state of US-China tech competition in one word or phrase?
So I think, unfortunately, it's really about choke point race, like a choke point race. And I think that's too tactical, an export control here or a new invention that's going to become critical there. And that's why we want to, again, going back to the report, we want to really shift the focus to another word or phrase, which would be really ecosystem building. So I think today, when you read the news and stuff, I think it's, still about choke point races and who's ahead today versus tomorrow.
Ilaria?
More interdependent than you think, right? That's generally my sense when I think about US-China tech competition. And that's partly the challenge, right? Is that you try and cut one thing off, you're also hurting yourself, right? And that's really the big trade-off that both countries face. And it's really complicated and makes it really fragile, although I think it sometimes gives us also these moments of truth, like I think the moment we're living right now and post ramp up in export controls on both sides.
Our answers were kind of identical, actually, right? Because you need the interdependence. You need the interdependence to have the choke point. So we're basically talking two sides of the same coin. So I'm glad we miraculously converged on that.
Okay, so now the kind of great power competition question, and you can ignore Russia if you want, but of the US, China, and Russia, who's had the best week? Who's had the worst week?
Because I'm not a Russia expert, but it seems like this was not a bad week for Russia on the military front, at least. So that's my sense.
And this is not an area that I know a whole lot about, but just since we're limited to 1 week, unfortunately, there wasn't an issue that was relevant to the report this particular week, but many other weeks there are. But I think, the expiration of New START probably is the one thing that would unite US, Russia, and China. I think the whole world is worst off, if you want to say worst off versus best off. I don't think this is good for anyone, including US, China, and Russia. If I had to choose one among the three, I would probably say maybe the US, possibly because sort of the capacity to build is there. But there's no constraints on anymore at all. I don't think. First time in like 50 years or something like that. But of course, I think China probably liked the New START the most because it constrained Russia and the United States in building. So maybe they're slightly worse off, but I think really the whole world is worse off.
Yeah. And I should say we are planning to do an episode on this. So
okay.
Well, now I've said to make sure.
Don't invite me because I'm not an expert on that.
But Mark has convinced me. I think that's a really good one. I think it's been like a surprisingly, stable week in many ways. So it was sort of difficult to pick exactly who had a better week or a worse week. I would say lately, I always pick the European Union as having the worst week.
Sure.
Been I think it's been a tough 12 months for the European Union in general.
Yes.
But,
that's well, I think Macron just said that he wants Europe to start thinking more in terms of itself as a superpower. So maybe, or a great, a great power actor on the world stage. So maybe I should add in the EU going forward. But anyway,
Yeah.
okay,
Well, when
last
does Macron
question.
not say that though? So.
Yeah, sure. Okay, is there one word or phrase that you would like to ban pundits from saying? Maybe when talking about US-China tech competition, anything else about technology, or more broadly? Is there anything that annoys you that you wish, that's just unhelpful to keep talking in these terms?
So I just think it's a category of terms. I think sort of the Cold War terminology analogy, I think, is not helpful. I think it's just lazy. Yes, okay, you've got two superpowers, fine. But the analogy of the Cold War just gets at me because, well, first of all, we want to pat ourselves on the back. Looks hopeful for the future, but the past is not, is not going to tell you about the future. I mean, the Cold War was, it was a political military competition. This is a tech commercial competition. China's extraordinarily high tech. They're a huge economy, unlike the Soviet Union. And we're, like Ilaria said, we're incredibly interdependent. Okay. So it just these whole, whether it's DeepSeek was the Sputnik moment, an AI arms race, you hear, Cold War 2.0, you hear it over and over and over again. And we just need to be a little bit more creative and not so lazy.
Okay.
In areas that I've been following, there's been a lot of this, this categorization of China as an electro state and the U.S. as a petro state. And I think, I think it's very clever. I think those who came up with it were, kudos to them. That's what everybody who writes papers wishes they could do, right? They come up with catchphrases. But I think people are going a little too far with it, and I think it only captures half of what's going on in either country, right? So I don't think it's actually. Let's say it's helpful only so much, and people shouldn't get carried away with it.
That's great because that's her area of specialization too. So I know a lot about that.
Yeah. Okay, let me attempt to sum up then what I have heard from you. So I think part of what you keep saying is it's not about this scorecard of who's up, who's down in particular technologies, but the report and you today have been arguing we need to think more broadly. We need to think about the ecosystems that enable technological advances. And then when talking about the different advantages that each country has, on China's side, you've highlighted the patient capital, the engineering innovation, the ability to develop prototypes and test, and then also, of course, scale. And that China can very cheaply and very quickly scale different technologies. And so that does give it key geopolitical advantages. Ilaria, I think you laid out three quite helpfully. There are military advantages. There's the choke points, the idea of economic security and leveraging interdependencies. And then also the idea of more of the sort of soft power geopolitical advantage of China becoming the provider of choice, particularly in the global south. And Mark, I think you said about the rule setting power that sort of can come from some of this. Then on the US side, the US a leader in stack technologies, in precision technologies, the example of the jet engines. But then I think also viewing the alliances and the alliance network as also another advantage it has that China can't really replicate. The idea that key US allies have, real advantages. Pax Silica is an interesting initiative to watch play out, but that ultimately, kind of does give the US key geopolitical advantages by leveraging that. And I think, Mark, you said you want to see more multilateralism, make sure that the US is at the table. They're shaping some of this. So on recommendations, just some of them to highlight. Speed to scale is the missing middle for the US. It's difficult to get great ideas out there very quickly. And so more of a focus on the later stage before commercialization. And also this idea of standardizing the skill sets that are going to be needed, this national AI workforce. We need skilled workers and standardizing it across different states would be helpful. And then thinking, and then I think, just in general, you've said, we do need to think more holistically about all of this. It's not the Cold War analogy. It's not the electro state versus the petro state. But think about how these different parts fit together into technological competition. And ultimately, there are a lot more interdependencies than we often think about. So I hope I somewhat did justice to what you've just said. And
My goodness, yes. Oh my God, that's really.
Really, you're better than an AI chat box.
stop
Seriously.
it.
And if my students took notes like that, I'd be extraordinarily pleased as a teacher. No, that's really amazing.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you. You have both been such a delight to have on this episode. Thank you so much. You've also, I think, made what is, sometimes not the most accessible topic, genuinely, accessible for the likes of me who don't focus on this, and I imagine lots of our listeners as well. So, as I said, I do encourage you, if you're listening to this and are interested to read more, to go out and read Tech Edge, a living playbook for America's technology long game. There's a video about it as well. There's an executive summary. It's very nicely organized in the different sections, so you can just choose the parts you're most interested in. But I want to say a huge thank you, Mark, Dallas, Ilaria Mazzocco. Thank you for being on today, and hope to have you back sometime in the future.
Thank you so
much.
Will.
It was a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. Until next time.